Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Harold Holzer, award-winning Lincoln Scholar and the Jonathan F. Fanton Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College of the City University of New York, and Tom Ruller, the recently retired New York State Archivist. Harold Holzer, winner of the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. A prolific writer and lecturer and frequent guest on television, Holzer served for 6 years from 2010 to 2016 as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. For the previous 10 years, he co-chaired the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, appointed by President Clinton. President Bush awarded Holzer the National Humanities Medal in 2008. And in 2013, Holzer wrote an essay on Lincoln for the official program at the re-inauguration of President Obama. He is now chairman of the Lincoln Forum. Today, we celebrate the publication of Mr. Holzer's new book, Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. Thomas J. Ruller recently retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he has held since 2015. Here, Tom oversaw care and access to the nearly 400 years worth of New York's colonial and state records. An active professional for 35 years, he is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations, focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. For those of you who have joined us today, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Harold Holzer and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie. And hello, Harold. It's wonderful to see you.
Tom, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, I'm especially excited to have this conversation today, because this book is one of the best books I've read in a long, long time.
Thank you.
It's so timely. It's so well written, but it's so timely. It really gets at the same issues that we're dealing with today. And it's a wonderful example of how history teaches us important lessons that are really relevant to what we're dealing with today, but also gives us the essential background that we need to be able to put what's happening in the world today into a more broad context. So thank you for writing this book.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I wish more people were learning from history, but I just want to, before we begin, to thank you for all you did as a state archivist and continue to do on the board where I serve as well. I think I'm the longest serving board member for an odd number of reasons, but you were so terrific, and you're terrific to do this. And I just want to express my gratitude to you and to Josie, who introduced us, for all of her great work on the magazine, which is better than ever.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I like to let's start at the beginning and maybe set a little context and sort of set the stage and talk about immigration during the early years of the Republic, so 1789 to roughly 1840. How did the United States government manage immigration, and what was the public sentiment about new immigrants during that period?
So, except for one exception, I guess the easy, I hope not too glib answer is that the federal government did not manage immigration. The thing that many people probably don't realize is that the Constitution gave the federal government authority over naturalization, but not immigration. So because the Constitution doesn't mention immigration specifically, the power fell to states and localities to police immigration. The only exception was with the Alien and Sedition Act in 1796. So for 3 or 4 years, the federal government required 14 years residency to become a citizen and deported people who were suspected, because the Federalists were in charge, of harboring a sympathy with the French and with Catholics generally. Then, when Jefferson came back to power, we go back to where it had been with all of the states that received immigrants, meaning Boston, Massachusetts, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Those are the embarkation points. In fact, and I know I'm segueing, but before the Civil War, 70% of all European immigrants disembarked in New York City. I know. So it is a New York State phenomenon. And it was so simple. If you came off a ship, you were required to give your name, your country of origin, and your gender. 5 years later, you could go to a citizenship office and by taking an oath, become a citizen of the United States. It was that simple. In fact, it was 2 years in the founding era till Alien and Sedition. Then it was 5 again. And that's what it was through the entire Civil War. And I just remind people there were no real borders. There were certainly no walls, no razor wire, no border security, no ICE, no deportation, and no prohibition against newcomers working. In fact, one of the reasons that Washington and Jefferson, who came from opposite political parties, both said that immigrants should come was because the country needed workers, farmers, people who were skilled in tailoring or weaving or the other skills, which I can't imagine anyone can be skilled in, but they are. So open doors, open borders, and a welcome mat.
All the way through the period up to, really, as you say, through the Civil War period.
Yeah, the only time the feds got, well, we can blame or credit Lincoln for some federal initiatives, which we get to later, but he kind of did as he chose during the Civil War, calling it war powers, and he assumed that he had war powers as commander-in-chief. But not until the Supreme Court began interpreting the Commerce Clause as applying to immigrants in the 1880s and 90s did the federal government begin to assert this unprovided right to govern immigration.
During this period, there were these nativists who seemed to, again, and I'm not sure how they got there, but intellectually, but really were almost virulently against certain classes of immigrants. The Catholics were a target all throughout this period.
Right.
The nativists seemed to be sort of, and they were associated largely with the Whig Party. And so Lincoln during the 40s and 50s, and he was a Whig.
Yeah,
during that period, but
for most of his career, he was a Whig.
But he seemed very skilled at sort of threading the needle. There was a group of Whigs who were strong nativists, and that's where there was a strong platform there. But there were also immigrant communities that he managed to cultivate and gain their support. How did he manage to build or maintain that coalition of two almost diametrically opposed communities?
Yeah, and I should have answered part of your first question was whether there was any resistance. And yes, there was increasing resistance to, particularly, as you say, the Catholics. And after the potato famine in 1845 in Ireland, which becomes the only country in Europe to lose population in the 19th century, Irish immigration really swells in the United States. And even as early as the 18-teens, people like Benjamin Franklin, for even the decade before, had been opposed to Catholics. German Catholics were the preponderant settlers in Philadelphia. He thought it was upsetting the wonderful hierarchy. And there's also a certain irony I want to point out, which I try to mention from time to time in the book. And you mentioned nativists. The gall involved in calling themselves, as they often did, Native Americans, because all of the welcoming of European Americans takes place in an atmosphere where nearly all white people, whether they're native born or foreign born, agree on the deportation and containment of real Native Americans, indigenous people. So there is a certain irony in this entire discussion that I point out. And of course, some of the people, some Democrats like Thomas Jefferson, who encouraged European immigration, also encouraged at one point the forced emigration of Africans. That's another irony that pervades the book, I think. So I didn't want it to be a book about American European immigration only, without highlighting maybe not quite hypocrisy, but the huge blind spots that white American leaders had in front of them during all of this period. Now, resistance. Yeah, the Whig Party had an anti-Catholic, pro-nativist element. And I think, although many historians think the Whig Party dissolved because it couldn't calibrate the slavery issue, I think it dissolved because it became not nativist enough, but it was nativist enough to offend Catholic voters, particularly the Irish, who joined the Democratic Party en masse. But it was not nativist enough to stop a breakaway movement, the Know Nothing movement, from becoming an independent political party. So how does Lincoln negotiate? As you point out, he's very deft. My friend Sidney Blumenthal, who, like me, has political experience and historian experience, but his political experience is at a much higher level. He was an aide to an advisor, I should say, to President Clinton in the White House. He calls Lincoln a hidden hand politician. So he's never pure enough for 21st century purists on a whole range of issues: racial justice, racial equality, voting rights. He's not there yet. And if he is there, he's not telling anybody about it. So in the 1840s, there is a horrendous riot in Philadelphia, a pushback against Catholics who had the audacity to say, we would like to read from our book of prayer for the mandated opening prayer in schools. I mean, let all that sift through our heads. So much has changed. And it was, they didn't want to use the King James Bible. They wanted to use the Catholic translation. You would have thought they would have asked for the Archbishop to take over the polling places. So not that there was an Archbishop in Philadelphia. So riots ensued, which are no laughing matter. Churches were burned, people were killed. The governor called out the state militia, and word spread that the Whigs were responsible. Whig newspapers were responsible for inciting violence against Catholics, which is a little bit simplistic because, in fact, it was the Catholics who beat up a bunch of nativist speakers who had the foolishness to do an event in the Catholic neighborhood of Kensington. So it's complicated. But the Whigs had to defend themselves because they're now being threatened with being called bigoted. There is a public meeting in Springfield, Illinois, in the summer of 1844, and there Abraham Lincoln makes his first formal statement about immigration as the person who's chosen to write a resolution, kind of exonerating the Whigs. That's the main purpose of it. But he says, everyone who learns a bit about America, he dropped that caveat later, should be entitled to residence and citizenship here. And we condemn violence against anyone, including Catholics. So he never made a public statement otherwise in his entire career. Plenty of Irish jokes, a few German jokes. And again, I'm probably talking too much. We can talk about the 1850s. But when the Know Nothing movement reached its apex in 1856, creating a national party that runs an independent candidate for president, the kind of hapless Millard Fillmore, who is never quite sure that he is a nativist, although he does accept the platform which says no foreign-born person can ever be a public official in the United States.
Right.
They get 22% of the vote in 1856. And after that, Lincoln is back after a brief hiatus, back in politics, trying to become a U.S. senator, trying to become president ultimately. And he needs a coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, And guess what? Know nothings
Nothing.
to create a new Republican Party and a new anti-slavery movement. And that's when things get a little tricky for him.
Mm-hmm. And Lincoln, and throughout your book, one of the couple of characteristics that show through with Lincoln in his speech, that one line, "We condemn violence against anyone." His basic humanity seemed to come through in terms of how he presented his perspective on immigration, but it colored everything that he did.
Absolutely. But he was also a politician. So while he would never dream of denying access to the United States, he would have been perfectly happy if the Irish found another place to go. Because as soon as they, not for religious reasons, but because as soon as they came here, they joined the opposition Democrats.
Right.
Whereas the new wave of Germans that began hitting our shores in great numbers after the failed revolutions of 1848 on the European continent began joining the Republican Party in large numbers. It was always a little bit split, not like the overwhelming Irish affiliation with the Democrats, but obviously Lincoln preferred German immigrants because they were on his side. But yes, never closed the doors to anyone.
Right. Well, you mentioned the Democrats, and I think Stephen Douglas is probably a good lightning rod to talk a little bit about them. He and other Democrats tried to paint Lincoln's anti-slavery perspective and anti-slavery position as anti-immigrant. They're stealing, well,
Right.
it doesn't make a level playing field. It's kind of the argument. How did he manage to demonstrate his support for the abolition of slavery as well as his support for the immigrant community? He kind of
remember, he's not publicly for abolition at this point. He's publicly for, and I don't even think he was privately there. He was publicly for ending any extension, preventing any extension of slavery beyond the states where it was already permitted and established under constitutional protection. But he thought it was a bridge too far for slavery to be allowed into the new Western territories that would ultimately form into states. And if they became slave states, then slavery would be perpetuated forever and become national, he believed. And he had a tough time because, again, to assemble opposition to the spread of slavery, he needed nativists. So we see filled in his private letters, the know-nothings are not entirely tumbled to pieces. We need to get them on our side. So he never said anything like, I hate the know-nothings. He said it privately. He didn't say it publicly. I mean, he said, there is a famous letter, very famous letter, that appears in every Lincoln biography. He says, I am not a know-nothing. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the mistreatment of Black people favor the mistreatment of certain classes of white people? It's not the most pleasant organizational thought, but he never sent that publicly. It was to his best friend back in Kentucky. And his best friend never made it public until Lincoln's death. So that is not a fair assessment of his willingness to express anti-know-nothing, anti-nativist sympathies. So you say, how did Douglas handle it? Well, Douglas was a pretty tough politician too. And he and the Democratic newspapers began saying, Abraham Lincoln wants Blacks to have the right to vote, but he doesn't want the Irish to have the right to vote. And that's in the newspapers, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and it's out there. And Lincoln is actually accused in that year and when he runs for president of having visited a know-nothing lodge. And keep in mind, the reason they're called know-nothing lodges is because they're secret meetings. And if anyone knocks on the door and says, this sounds like a lot of fun, what's going on here? The man at the door is supposed to say, I know nothing. At least that's the myth about how that name, by the way, is supposed to have been created in New York, where we create all the best advertising by Horace Greeley, but that is not provable. Anyway, so Lincoln makes two wonderful statements during this campaign. Do I have time to just briefly?
Yes, please.
So before the Lincoln-Douglas debates begin in August, Lincoln is invited to a July 4th picnic in Chicago by a bunch of Germans, influential Germans. For some reason, he doesn't go. And I worked for Mario Cuomo for 8 years. He would say he was going to places and then he wouldn't go. I never got it. I never understood what gets into these people to say I'll be there and then to say I won't be there. Lincoln was like that. I often wonder if Mario studied that model. It's about not showing up at the last minute. Lincoln didn't go to a picnic. It was a massive gathering of Republicans, foreign-born Republicans, and every newspaper would say that hands were shaken, politicians were making the rounds. We know, we who are interested in politics know these events take place in Albany and New York City all the time. And so on July 11th, a few days after, maybe it was the 10th, a few days after he didn't appear, Stephen Douglas gave a speech in Chicago at the Tremont House, the big hotel, and Lincoln spoke the next day. This is before the debates. They were speaking one after the other. And Lincoln begins his kind of delayed July 4th address. And he looks in the audience and he sees the Germans whom he'd snubbed. One leader was a gigantic guy, so he was, I would guess, identifiable. Lincoln saw him right away. And he said, something like, and I'm going to paraphrase heavily, I see among you people who are descended from the founders, that wonderful generation that gave us our democracy. But I also see people who were born elsewhere or are the children of those born elsewhere. And I just want to say that the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, applies to you as it does to those descendants, because you are the blood of that generation as much as those who were born here. Just think about that statement in terms of those who now say that immigrants are poisoning the blood of America. Lincoln was saying they were enriching the blood. And that is another example of basic humanity. I think he really did believe that, not to disagree with myself, but again, it was a bunch of Germans. During the campaign, he was heckled by Irish and German voters about being nativist in his heart, but he pushed back. He said during the debates, he said, I want an America where the West is open, and he did say to whites, but including Hans and Baptiste and Patrick, which I guess means Germans, I don't know, Frenchmen.
French, yeah.
And the word Patrick may have stuck in his craw, but he got it out. And Patrick too. And he lived by that.
So you talked a little bit about I'll say not the great relationship between Lincoln and the Irish community. But he really over time developed a strong and pretty long-lasting relationship with the German immigrant community, and
yes,
including, I think he wrote some essays that were reprinted in German language newspapers.
Well, his greatest speech in New York, the Cooper Union Address, was published in a German edition and a Dutch edition.
There we go. But what did that relationship mean for him, particularly for his political career? And how did he manage to maintain it? You just told us this great story about the speech in Chicago, but he had to do other things, I'm sure.
He did. And he also had to win over German politicians at the 1860 presidential nominating convention, because most of them, including probably the Frederick Douglass of the German community, Carl Schurz of Wisconsin, was pledged to William Seward of New York. Why was that? Because Seward was a really just overtly pro-immigrant governor when he was governor of New York. Early in his career, he was known as the boy governor. He once even supported the idea of state aid to parochial schools, which was shot down, but the immigrant community never forgot that. And he was also a very good friend of John Hughes, who was known as Dagger John by some people. He was the highest ranking Catholic prelate in the United States. He was the Bishop of New York, and then he was the first American Archbishop of New York, and they were close. So Seward got most of the immigrant support. Lincoln's job was to convert the Seward guys to his cause. He had one leading German, Gustav Kerner, who had been the first German elected lieutenant governor in Illinois, and was a very close friend and loyal supporter. And he converted Schurz and the others overnight. Schurz became the head of I think it was actually called the Foreign Relations Committee of the National Committee. And organized speaking tours, German speaking tours throughout Illinois, speaking for Lincoln. Now, we don't have sophisticated enough polling. We don't have any polling, but very hard to do precinct by precinct analysis because we don't have ethnic analysis unless you go into tiny precincts where we know there were German communities. I didn't go there because better researchers than I have tried for 75 years, and it's just not provable. But he did very well among Germans. Now, Lincoln was going to win that election with or without the Germans because there was a three-way split in the opposition. So he was pretty much going to prevail. But his vote in Wisconsin, Illinois may have actually turned on the German vote, but with strong support in Wisconsin, strong support in Ohio, and yet in Missouri, with a giant German population in St. Louis, it was a totally anti-slavery vote. It was no Republican support in Missouri. But he, from the minute he was elected, he built on that support the old-fashioned way, gave patronage jobs, federal appointments, diplomatic posts, postmasterships to Germans principally. And much of our diplomatic corps spoke with a German accent when Lincoln took office. And, those are the people he wanted to keep in his corner because they would return if he ever needed them, re-election, off-year elections, etc.
Yep. And he, in that first election, he only had less than 40% of the popular vote, but really did very well in the Electoral College.
Yeah, he ran away with electoral because of the three-way split against him. But yeah, only 39.9, didn't crack 40.
Talk a little bit more about the German community and sort of fast forward or move forward towards the war. And the German community strongly supported the war effort. And I think on our screen here, we've got a great picture of Elmer Ellsworth, who was a strong recruiter in Elmira, New York.
Yeah.
For the war effort.
And indeed, as the headline says, one of the first to fall. I think the first officer killed in the Civil War trying to tear down a Confederate flag from a hotel in Alexandria, where I'm going to be speaking on Tuesday, the 22nd, I think. But the way that Ellsworth becomes part of this story is, and just to backtrack for 1 second, Lincoln has two genius ideas when Fort Sumter is attacked. One of them is to make sure Democrats volunteer, not just Republicans. So this is not perceived as an anti-slavery Republican war. And the second brilliant idea, and I think it's born in New York. We like to say all of our great ideas are born in this state. But the idea of getting the foreign-born to join. Now, the Army regulations say you have to speak English. Lincoln basically said, never mind, we'll change the law later. And so there is, and I think this all gets into his head because he asks an Irishman, an Irish lawyer, will you raise a regiment? And the man says, no, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to lead men. I'm a lawyer. And, he was a young Ireland nationalist, so Lincoln thought he would be good. And Lincoln said, I don't understand. I thought all the Irish would love to wear epaulets and would be courageous. So the idea died for a few days. Then on April 20th, there was a massive rally at Union Square in Manhattan, 100,000 people. And the speakers include Germans and Irish. And the Germans, I love this man's name, Ignaz Koch. He stands up and he says, we are Germans, we love the fatherland, but we swore allegiance to this country. The flag that was desecrated at Fort Sumter, and by the way, it was hanging there at the rally on George Washington's statue, it was all draping it. We will fight for this new country. And then an Irish speaker got up and said, we don't particularly like Abraham Lincoln. We didn't support him, but he's our president. And the attack on that flag, again pointing to the Sumter flag, was worse even than the British fleet coming into New York Harbor. So Lincoln, I think from that minute gets the idea, and he draws up memos in consultation with Bishop Hughes, by the way, on whom he wants to recruit among the Irish. The Germans, he did even faster. He recruited this early poster boy for recruitment, Franz Sigel in Missouri. And
Mhm.
although Sigel was always more celebrated for his organized retreats than for his attacks, he was, I fight Smith Sigel became a rallying cry in the West. And whenever Lincoln tried to transfer him or demote him, there was an outcry. So he kept him, and he was one of many German officers and generals. The aforementioned Carl Schurz got one of the best diplomatic posts available to Lincoln. Ambassador to Spain. He really lobbied for it. Seward, of all people, didn't want him after he'd supported Seward, but he got the job. And then before he goes, he gets cold feet. Well, not cold feet. He gets hot feet. He says, I want to fight. I don't want to go yet. Please give me a few months to recruit. He goes to New York to raise a German cavalry unit. But by the time he gets there, Lincoln's early call for volunteers and that rally have used up the available German population. And this is where our friend Elmer Ellsworth gets into the story. He hears that Ellsworth is raising a Zouave regiment in Elmira and adding to it among New York firemen in New York. And he says, well, why don't I take over Ellsworth's regiment and I will command it, not him. Who's ever heard of him? Well, lots of people had heard of him. He was a drill master. He was a public performer of high-speed drills. Think of that as entertainment. It's like, the Irish clog dancing. It's very fast. And Ellsworth was an attraction. And he was also, this was stupid of Schurz, because Ellsworth was also a young friend of Abraham Lincoln's, who had come with him to protect him on his inaugural journey. So Ellsworth got the gig, and Ellsworth was killed as a result of his insistence that he lead his own regiment, as he did very colorfully and bravely. But anyway, the Irish. Could I just spend a minute on the Irish?
Yeah, please.
Lincoln writes down, with I think Bishop Hugh's connivance or assistance, the names of 3 people he wants. The first is Michael Corcoran. Michael Corcoran, who is one of the heads of the Fenian Brotherhood and an Irish New York politician, really knows ward politics. He is being court-martialed at the time because he refused to assemble the 69th Regiment, the famous Fighting Irish, as it was later known. He refused to assemble them when the Prince of Wales visited New York City. He said, these Irish boys are not standing at attention for the heir to the British throne. So he's being court-martialed. Suddenly, when Lincoln said he wanted him, he wasn't being court-martialed. His deputy was Thomas Francis Marr, another hero of the Irish nationalist movement, who had been banned to Australia by the British, escaped, made his way to America, to Boston, to New York, and was a great hero of Irish resistance. He joined the 69th, marching down Broadway, and fought at Bull Run. Corcoran was captured, and then Marr took over the regiment. And Marr was, together with a kind of wasted away Corcoran, because he was treated brutally in Southern prisons, were like Franz Sigel, poster boys for German recruitment in the East. The third is the most interesting, James Shields. And you're nodding because I guess you read this in the book. James Shields was an former Illinois politician, and a senator from 2 states by that time. But as a young man, he was the Illinois auditor. And Lincoln, who had broken up with his fiancée, reunited with her just to, I don't know, his courting style was to sit with Mary Todd and write anti-Irish satires of James Shields. James Shields became infuriated, demanded to know of the newspaper editor who published the offending piece, and it really is pretty bad. It's pretty grotesque. Who wrote this? And the newspaper man asked Lincoln, "What should I do?" And Lincoln said, "Well, just give my name, don't give Mary's." And he did. And Shields demanded an explanation. Lincoln tried to be too cute, lawyerly, and Shields challenged him to a duel. They went off to an island, technically in Missouri, because it's now, interestingly, doesn't exist anymore. I really always wanted to visit this island, but the accretion of the Mississippi River means it's been sucked into a landmass. They went to Bloody Island, as it was called, because it was a dueling place.
Mhm.
Lincoln got the choice of weapons, and he chose broadswords. And for the half hour before the duel was set to commence, he took this sword out and with his long arms practiced by shearing off the branches of trees with one swoop. So suddenly Shields said, well, maybe we should settle our differences and shake hands. So there was no duel. And Lincoln, Mary was impressed because she married the guy. Lincoln never wanted anyone to mention this again. It was mortifying. So I think it took a lot for him to go after Shields, who by then was, who later became a hero, the Irish hero of the Mexican-American War, and a senator from 2 states. He went after Shields, and even though people said he wasn't particularly keen on defending the Union, that he had Southern sympathies, he did come all the way back to Washington. They had a kind of tense reunion, I imagine, and Shields entered the Union service. The Republicans hated him so much that they wouldn't remember how the Tuberville wouldn't allow votes on promotions. The Senate turned down his appointment as Major General. So, but he soldiered on, no pun intended, and he met a dueling partner who was even more threatening than Abraham Lincoln, Stonewall Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
So very few of these guys actually had great military careers, but the symbolism far outweighed what they brought to the battlefield.
And if I remember right, Shields came all the way back to Washington from Mexico, where he was living at the time. He was on
a very long honeymoon.
Okay.
With his second wife, a second Irish colleen he had married. Yes, the press didn't talk too much about that. They said he was coming back from California, because I think he went up to California first. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln, by the way, when he was finished losing to Stonewall Jackson the second time, I think, Lincoln transferred him to the Department of California as the far western Little Army was called, which gave Shields, as I point out in the book, a free transcontinental voyage back home, after which time he retired once from the service, and then became a senator from at least one more state. I think he's the only man to serve that many states as a U.S. senator. And there's a statue of him in Statuary Hall, not too far from where Lincoln served in the House of Representatives. It's the same chamber.
Yep. And all that is really so well chronicled in this book. You know, the transfer, because you don't know that Shields winds up being a general in the Union Army.
Right.
You're reading how
until you get there, right?
And Abraham are writing these really caustic articles for that newspaper the Whig newspaper.
Yeah, the State Journal.
Yeah. Little more back to politics. The competing priorities of abolition of slavery and the promotion and support of immigrants seem to be a recurring theme throughout Lincoln's public and perhaps private life. How was he able to manage both of those competing priorities? I
try really hard not to suggest that immigration was ever an equal priority. But immigration was, among other things, as you say, a representation of his basic core humanity, but it was also a means toward accomplishing the abolition of slavery, because the more Germans who enrolled in the Republican Party and became active in politics in swing states, the more chance there was to move on what ultimately became enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation in the Army, and then ultimately getting 3/4 of the states after Lincoln died to ratify the Abolition Amendment to the Constitution. So they were basically intertwined. The know-nothing element kind of disappears. We don't hear later that Thaddeus Stevens, the kind of second hero of the Lincoln movie, who pushes that amendment through, was a know-nothing, was a nativist, or that Salmon Chase, who was to the left of Lincoln on emancipation and abolition, and Lincoln made him Chief Justice in 1864, that Chase also said, I'm not going to fight against the know-nothings. You know, one battle at a time, I'm battling the pro-slavery people. So it was not an equal priority, but it was a means toward an end. And I think it was consistent with his belief that America should be open and that we needed people. We needed people to work, and we need in civilian industry and farms, and we needed people to serve in the armed forces. I mean, Lincoln called for 75,000 men in April of 1861. It was going to be 1 million men by the time it's over. I mean, he never could not have envisioned that desperate and continuous need for manpower.
And that seems to be, it's clear that Lincoln recognized the tremendous benefit of immigration, both to the growth and prosperity of the country, the part of the economic engine, and to increase the population, which is, again, exponentially over time, but also to provide the soldiers, the people who were on the ground defending the Union. And so his recognition of this great benefit, which continues to this day. I think I've read recently, New York would be a 0 or negative population growth if it were not for immigrants and refugees moving into the state of New York. We would have maybe 3 people in the House of Representatives, but that's a different story. But so was Lincoln successful at developing public policy that supported the benefits that immigrants brought to the country?
Yeah, I think this is where my book closes, with his State of the Union message. Well, it opens with it and then ends with it. His State of the Union message in 1863 calls for the first Federal Bureau of Immigration, more regulation of these fetid transatlantic vessels that were filled with rats and disease, expanding the biggest entry point in the United States, not Ellis Island, but Castle Garden in downtown Manhattan. And also his side recommendation, not in his address, well, it wasn't an address, it was a message, a written message, was, and this sounds so radical, and indeed it was too radical for Congress, underwriting the cost of transatlantic voyages. Because as Lincoln said in 1863, we need new citizens. Immigration had trickled. Why? Nobody wants to get into a shooting war. Right. And B, in March of earlier, 9 months before the annual message, the federal draft had gone into effect. So Lincoln had to excuse immigrants from the draft ultimately to spur immigration. He had to include, and he did include immigrants in this extraordinary homestead bill, which gave Americans, white Americans ultimately, but Americans the right to claim a stake in a Western land, formerly indigenous land. Again, that irony is there, and then work and improve it for X number of years, and then you own it. And he extended that to foreign-born even before they were citizens. What ultimately happened is that they created a system where private companies would kind of bankroll immigrants and refugees and migrants. I like using those words. In return for which the people who took advantage of that support would create a system of paying back the debt over time, even if it meant 1 year's wages. Some of the demands were pretty strong. Was it a system of indenture? I mean, it's not a great system, but it was the only system in the world where a combination of public and private forces were encouraging and facilitating immigration. And then in his next annual message, Lincoln says his most explicit thing about immigration. Immigrants are the replenishing stream appointed by Providence to sustain our nation and to fill the vacancies left by war and the ravages of war. That's really important to me, being something of a student of Lincoln's evolving religious beliefs, along with his evolving beliefs on slavery and immigration. But Lincoln, only a year before, had said that God willed the war continue. And so forth, we just have to continue the war, because if God didn't will it, it wouldn't be continuing. Sort of absolving himself of a guiding hand. And then in a few months after his final message to Congress, he'll say in his famous second inaugural, if every drop of blood drawn with a lash has to be repaid with one drawn with the sword. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That's from scripture. But again, he's saying God wills the war. And the reason I cite those two, which, embrace the third one, the middle one, is that now Lincoln is saying God wills immigration as well. And that's important to remember how strongly he, by this point, either uses or cites divine will to argue for the replenishment of the population and the embrace of diversity at this point. Because the war has brought us Germans, Irish, British, Swedish, Norwegian, Scotsmen. I mean, there were wonderful, colorful New York units from every ethnic group. Hungarians, the famous Garibaldi Guard, which was Hungarians, Italians, and unfortunately led by someone with a fake name who had been a horse thief in Germany. And when he got into the battle, into the field, he realized that he had hit the mother lode of horses. So he became a horse thief again and ends up in prolonged residence at one of New York's most famous institutions, Sing Sing.
And just to put in a plug for archives and the New York State Archives, all those soldiers that enlisted in New York and were volunteers, their service records are all preserved in the state archives and available online. And in most cases, their ethnicity is recorded on their service record. So
yeah, it's a great resource. And of course, their names are a giveaway too. And it's interesting. I'm appearing at an event in California in a few weeks, and my fellow speakers include people named Simons, Gallagher, and Waugh. So I just looked up one regiment. I looked up a few. The Irish regiment had a Gallagher, it had a Simons, and the Scottish regiment had a Waugh and a Ray, R-H-E-A. And I'm also speaking with a historian named Gordon Ray. So I'm going to call them all out for their glorious ancestral service to the war.
Excellent. We're running out of time. Let's talk a little bit about the book, Brought Forth on This Continent, which is in print now and available.
Right.
People can order it from, how can
Amazon. Amazon is the easiest and the fastest. And I must say, I've never opened a book of mine on Amazon and seen the words bestseller or top pick, but we've had a great opening couple of days, and I'm really excited about it. I took screenshots of all of those banners. It's amazing how hard it is to record a screenshot on a computer screen because the lines don't show, but they show on camera.
And it will be, I think, a blockbuster bestseller, Harold. It is a phenomenal read, and it is incredibly educational.
Sorry about the phone ring. We get absolutely no calls on our landline. This is spam. It says so. I beg your pardon.
That's quite all right. Quite all right. So I encourage anyone who's watching this now or recording, go out, buy this book. It is phenomenal. And if you'd like a taste of it, in the current issue of New York Archives magazine, there's a little brief 3,000-word essay that covers this same territory to give you a taste of what you can get in this wonderful book.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. I've seen the galleys. I also should mention, for those people who don't like Amazon for one reason or another, and support independent bookstores, there's a wonderful one called the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. It's been there for 75 years. One of my dear friends has owned it for more than 50. And you just go on Abraham Lincoln Bookshop online, and you also get the book with a first day of issue plate that I signed a number of so that he could offer them with that.
That's Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Okay, perfect. And then last but not least, the New York Archives magazine has something called New York Archives Junior, and we'll be publishing a dedicated issue to this, using Harold's article and this book as the platform. It's a great opportunity to sort of educate the K-12 community, children, teachers, and all the parents about immigration and what it means or what it meant up to the Civil War.
And by the way, for those who think that who might be concerned that I'm offering this as a lesson to modern times, I know that modern times are different, but I also know that we have a national ethos of lighting the lamp beside the golden door. New York was 51% foreign born at the dawn of the Civil War. The Union Army spoke with a foreign accent. I mean, 25% of the Union Army was foreign born, and another couple of 100,000 were first generation German or Irish. New York City is 36% foreign born today. Less than in 1860 proportionally, which should cheer us because it reflects the best of us, I think. It's what we have always offered, which is, again, a place for the refuse or the wretched refuse. I mean, that's kind of a derogatory term, but we're obligated by history and morality and justice to lift that lamp, I think. Lincoln would have.
Well said. Josie, I see we've got a few questions that have come in, and can we turn it over to you? But before we do, Harold, I just want to say thank you again.
Tom, I love talking about history with you. So anytime, on or off the air, preferably on, but anytime.
Well, thank you so much. As Tom said, we do have a couple of questions. One of our guests would like you to explain in more detail when, why, and how the federal government exerted its authority over immigration.
Okay. There were a series of cases in the Supreme Court challenging state authority to regulate immigration. Massachusetts at one point, for example, increased the residency requirement for voting from 5 to 7 years. That was eventually pushed back on. But there was a famous case of a ship captain who refused to collect $1 head taxes for incoming refugees. And those were collected in Massachusetts, for example, to bankroll public facilities for the indigent and the sick. Someone challenged it. Is it legal? The court said, yes, the states still have the right. Then the post-Civil War court tilted, and I think with the stigma of the slave trade now 75 years old, they were able, at least legally, they made the case that the Commerce Clause in fact could apply, that it's in the national interest to have national regulations. That last law of Lincoln's was signed in 1865 after Lincoln died, but it was his last bill, and it opened new immigrant stations in Boston and Philadelphia and New Orleans, which I found interesting because it was the first international city that he ever visited as a teenager. But I don't think I made that point in the book, and I should have, but that's all right. Between 1865 and 1965, when Lyndon Johnson signed a bill that increased quotas for immigration, every piece of federal legislation, as made possible by court decisions, was restrictive. For 100 years, all we did was push back. And now we have a reliance on the 14th Amendment to justify birthright citizenship, which some people challenge, when it was a foregone conclusion during the Civil War era that anyone born in the United States and anyone who was here for 5 years was a citizen or was eligible for citizenship. So that's, there are some wonderful books just on the court cases. I don't get into it because it's post-Lincoln, and for me, all roads begin and end with Lincoln. But it is a fascinating assumption of powers that were not in the Constitution specifically.
We have another question that I think is an interesting one, and you've been studying Lincoln for decades, so maybe there are no more surprises, but was there anything that you were surprised by when you were doing the research for this book?
Yeah, I guess just not having looked at this issue until I decided I wanted to, which really was about 5 years ago. I just postponed it. I did another book first. And then I regretted it because I thought, between now and between 2018 and 2024, of course, we'll solve this. And of course, we can't seem to even legislate. We can't even legislate restrictions, much less the birthright and the dreamer aspect of it. Yeah, so I didn't know nearly enough about it until I started to delve into this. The pandemic lockdown was very useful in terms of pushing me to archived records that, great archivists like Tom have made available electronically and encouraged to be made available electronically. These are just aspects of Lincoln I had not studied. I know I've read all of these things before, but putting them together, creating a line of his consistent support, but his growth on embracing immigration was new to me. The details of ethnic recruiting were new to me. His one-to-one with foreign-born, thickly accented people was new to me. And his private secretary was born in Bavaria and has spoke with a thick German accent. He was known as the grim Teutonic Cerberus at the gate. Cerberus is a mythical figure who guards the gates of hell. And thanks to a colleague of mine, my colleague, mentor really, discovered that this German-born secretary, John Nicolay, never really applied for citizenship. Technically, he wasn't eligible to be on the White House payroll, but it just seems to have passed him by. Maybe he thought he had. And just a shout out to that mentor. His name is Wayne Temple. I've always had a particular affection for him because he was born on my birthday, February 5th. But this year, when I celebrated a milestone, which I won't get into detail about, but made me a little bit depressed, he called me to say happy birthday on his 100th birthday. So that's a good sign for February 5th people, I think.
It's a great story. And I think, that's the exciting thing about doing research in archives is that you're always going to learn something new, even.
Absolutely. I found wonderful stuff from Carl Schurz in the Library of Congress, for example. Didn't always write in English, but when he wrote in English, he was a very canny politician as well as a military leader. So yeah, there is nothing like the original sources. And what I'd recommend for anybody who undertakes any kind of a project is try to shut down or shut out the easier access points. It's not all about what Wikipedia has edited for you and curated for you. Dig deep, dig deeper, and you'll find things that no one else, anyone who is persistent can find things that I guarantee a historian has not noticed.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up now, but I want to thank you, Harold, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And Tom, thank you for your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit archives.nysed.gov. That's the website of the New York State Archives. And our website is nysarchivestrust.org. That's the website of the Archives Partnership Trust. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see some more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And if you're not a subscriber yet, now is a perfect time to do it because, as Tom said, our upcoming spring issue that should be out in April will have Harold's article in it, and it will also contain the New York Archives Junior that's based on that article, featuring learning activities focused on primary source analysis. It's a really great resource.